wild example of covert operation. That, in other words, the idea of essentially what we did in Mafia Spies, the CIA hired two gangsters in this subject because this was not some made-up conspiracy. This was a conspiracy that actually the CIA acknowledged. It took them a while. 2007 was formally when the CIA actually acknowledged that they had done this. There was
Family Jewels?
Exactly. In that was the name of a memo that contained a lot of the undercover things that the CIA had been doing. But for me, Mafia Spies was a way, I said about a window. It was a window in really the high water mark of the mafia in this country.
Yes.
Bear in mind, when you drive into New York, a lot of the spoils of the mafia here in New York, and I've covered that for at least 40 years, is divided among 5 families historically. In Chicago, it's really one family. It's the family essentially that Al Capone developed and was inherited by, the reins were given over to Sam Giancana. There were a couple of other folks, Tony Accardo, who preceded him, was still kind of like the consigliere. He was he was quote unquote retired, but he's kind of retired the way I'm retired. He's still working. And so he kind of oversaw things that Giancana, but Giancana was the day-to-day guy. He was the boss in Chicago, known as the Outfit. And they really controlled virtually everything west of the Mississippi. So they were very involved with Johnny Roselli in Hollywood. They increasingly were involved in Las Vegas. And so I thought this was a really good opportunity to talk about the mafia at its high water mark here. And then the marriage of the two, the CIA and the mafia involved in this effort to kill Fidel Castro. To me, it was fascinating, the fact that they acknowledge it, that it had so many implications to other things, including the investigation of JFK's assassination. There's consequences that result, that influence that as well. But also, today, we just recently, in the last few months, we've had a Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, which basically means that the president, according to the Supreme Court right now, any official acts that the president can do, that the president would be immune from prosecution. Now, in the oral arguments for that case, Clarence Thomas, who's one of the justices on the Supreme Court, actually mentions, he poses a question about Operation Mongoose, which is the name of the operation that we're talking about with Mafia Spies. In other words, the attempts to kill Fidel Castro. Back in 1960, they were all concerned. They kept it top secret because, among other things, they didn't want to go to jail. They thought if you were trying to have a murder plot to kill somebody, you could be liable for some type of prosecution. So I think right now, with the whole decision about presidential immunity, and what is that going to mean? And does it mean that the president of the United States can have a plot to murder somebody, some political enemy? That seems to be, at least in the eyes of myself and a number of other critics of the Supreme Court decision, it makes the whole story of Mafia Spies almost like a lesson, a warning about what can happen if things are not overseen properly, if our intelligence agencies are not overseen properly.
I'm trying to think of the best place to start with this, and I think you're actually on the right strand here, not surprisingly. But, at the core of this is also we're talking about the earliest years of the CIA. So when people look at the history of it, most people out there listening know that there was something called the OSS in World War II, which was essentially spun up to be what would later become the CIA. Right. But at the end of the war, America still had these weird feelings about, traditionally about like, oh, do we need espionage or something? So it's almost like they were going to get away from it. But then the people who had run the OSS, like the Allen Dulleses of the world, were like, fuck that, we're making a CIA. They make a CIA in 1947, I believe.
Very good.
But there's this weird gap during the Truman and Eisenhower years, where it's almost as if, at least the way we know it from the history we've been given access to, they were strictly more an espionage agency.
Right.
And then when Castro takes over in 59, Eisenhower loses his shit and says, we got to whack this guy.
That's exactly right. With mafia spies, what I'm telling my readers, and certainly we're making the point in the TV show, is that this is a major change for the CIA. It had been historically, as you mentioned, gathering intelligence, economic, political intelligence, but we didn't get directly involved in countries to the extent that we would try to assassinate them. That's what mafia spies represents, is the change from gathering intelligence to instead getting involved in covert actions. And the attempt to kill Castro is the most overt, it's the most wild example of covert operation. That, in other words, the idea of essentially what we did in Mafia Spies, the CIA hired two gangsters to kill Fidel Castro in an operation that was based in Florida. And most Americans had no idea that it was going on. It was an undeclared war that we were running out of southern Florida.
Right state to do it.
well, you get a lot of tans, and it only 90 miles away in Cuba.
Yeah.
There were all these operations, the training of a number of Cuban exiles who wanted to return to their homeland, and the fact that Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana get involved in this, it's just an extraordinary set of circumstances.
Yeah, and a guy who's obviously at the middle of it is the director of the CIA at the time, Alan Dulles, who you and I were talking right before camera. You're familiar with Talbot's work, Devil's Chessboard.
Right.
So when I read that book, that was an eye-opener for me. Annie Jacobson's Operation Paperclip that talks a bit about that as well was definitely an eye-opener for me. That guy seems to be at the middle of pretty much everything. Am I exaggerating when I say that?
No, absolutely not. In fact, let's talk about Alan Dulles for a moment. Alan Dulles was a great spy in World War II. They, as you mentioned, the OSS, he had worked with the OSS, and then they sent him to Switzerland, which was a neutral country during World War II. And he set up a lot of different spy operations, very effective. Truman disassembled the OSS when he became president after World War II, said it's not necessary, and disassembled it for about 2 years. And then they realized, whoa, we do need a spy agency. And eventually Alan Dulles is put as the head of the CIA. His brother had, at that time, was the Secretary of State, or would be soon the Secretary of State. He served under Eisenhower. And so particularly by the 1950s, it was a really interesting brother combination of a guy running the spy agency and the other one running the State Department. And it leads to another interesting brother duo, the Kennedy brothers. So what happens is in the late 50s, in the last stages of the Eisenhower administration, when Castro takes power, there's a revolution in Cuba. And we initially think, well, maybe he'll be a reformer, that he's maybe a good guy. He'd replace this big bad dictator, Batista. A number of newspapers like the New York Times here in New York. Castro came to visit New York, and he was embraced in many ways.
That's wild.
But as it turns out, Castro allied himself. We kind of mishandled things with Castro, too. And I think we kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say bully was the right word, but he was a firebrand, a guy who had led a revolution. So he wasn't going to be listened to some big entity, some other big country telling him what to do. And I think that was part of it. But I think historians, as we look at Castro, really he was a socialist, and he wound up Cuba wound up becoming a puppet of the Soviet Union, the Russians, the communists at that time. And Castro clearly established himself as a communist. So for the Eisenhower and for Allen Dulles, that was something that was just unacceptable. It was an unacceptable threat. At the same time, in the late 50s, the Russians were the first ones up in space with the Sputnik satellite. So the idea that maybe the Russians could put a nuclear weapon on the top of that rocket, and suddenly, and we were yet to get into space after World War II. The United States, we were preeminent in the world. We were the first to develop the atomic bomb. So it was really shocking to official Washington, almost 15 years after World War II, that the Russians are up in space, and now 90 miles away from Florida is another satellite, Cuba, a Russian satellite that's capable eventually, within a year or two, Castro was allowing the Russians to bring in nuclear missiles. And when that began, that really set off the alarm bells. And it was up to the CIA. It was this Operation Mongoose was the name of it. But it was an attempt to overthrow and get rid of Castro. The phrase was sawed off. Eisenhower said he wanted him sawed off. But essentially, in translation, what it meant was that to assassinate.
Yes.
And get rid of Castro. And because I think, particularly in the minds of somebody like Allen Dulles and certainly in Eisenhower, coming out of World War II, there was a lot of talk about, well, if we had assassinated Hitler, there were talks about assassinating Hitler early on in the late 30s, early 40s. And there were a couple of unsuccessful attempts. But the feeling was if we had gotten rid of Hitler earlier, so many millions of lives would have been saved, so much destruction to the world. So the idea, is Hitler a fair comparison with Castro? Well, not really on one level, but on another level, the fact that he was willing to let the Russians bring in nuclear missiles and then lead to a possible nuclear confrontation with rockets only 90 miles away from the United States shore, in the minds of those folks at that time, policymakers, the decision was made that he was an unacceptable risk. Not unlike what we would think about with somebody like Osama bin Laden for a later generation.
Yeah, thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.